Hey everyone, in today's show, I'm going to focus on the differences between hostile work environment harassment and bullying, and why understanding these differences is absolutely critical for HR professionals, and especially professionals tasked with conducting employee relations investigations. You won't want to miss this one.
Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivy, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's show. Today, I'm going to examine the differences between hostile work environment and bullying in the workplace. So let's get started. Let's talk first about bullying. In my previous episode, I examined hostile work environment. So in this one, I'm going to talk about bullying, and then in a little bit, I'm going to get into some discussion on the differences between them. All right, so bullying. Definitely this is becoming much more prevalent. I personally dealt with some cases recently in which bullying was a pretty big deal. What exactly is it, though? Well, I think all of us at some point in our careers, we could probably have described someone's being a bully. And a lot of times when you think of bullying, you do tend to think of supervisors. However, I can tell you that I worked with another employee who was a peer who really was a bully, and I had an employee at one point who was very much a bully. But it's a serious issue for a lot of employers. And, well, why? Well, first of all, it can cause sometimes even physical harm. You get bullying behavior with someone who really can't even control themselves. They have a serious anger management problem. That's part of it, and that actually crosses the line into workplace violence. But it can really do more psychological harm. And what it does is it creates this environment sometimes that is so toxic that it just really drives a lot of turnover. Typically, in my world as an HR consultant, when I see that there's a tremendous amount of turnover in one particular position and really turning over people pretty frequently, why is that? There's usually some leadership failure that is going on, but oftentimes when you peel back the layer of the onion, so to say, you find that it's a leader that has been engaging in some bullying. What are kind of the different elements of bullying? Well, the psychological and physical harm. Well, what can happen is individuals who are constantly putting up with this, and I'm not really going to focus on like the physical piece, but it's really more of the psychological symptoms of depression, but more than anything, anxiety and stress. When working for a bully, and particularly one that is in a supervisory role, they may drop assignments at the very, very last minute and give very little instruction. And so that on the one hand could be deemed as leadership behavior, but what you also can see is if it's a pattern of behavior to do this and then give someone a short timeline and say, hey, I need this by 5:00. And they drop it on someone's desk at 4:15 and expect them to just turn this around before they even leave the office, right? Over a period of time, that kind of pattern of behavior can definitely be bullying. It establishes a bit of psychological power over, quote, the victim. The one who is the victim usually doesn't feel a sense of wanting to speak out, because if they speak out and speak against it, then they fear maybe even further, deeper bullying behavior. And sometimes that can really be the case. When a bully sees that someone is going to somewhat push back or challenge them. Now, sometimes that could also really foil a bully. I can tell you personally, in my experience, pushing back very specifically with a bully got them to back down, and they never did it again, and challenging them. But sometimes depends on, the victim. If the victim somewhat timidly tries to push back, like, well, oh gosh, I really, really need to leave today. Does this have to be done today? Then the bully will take that as an opening of, aha, I can swoop in there and say, yes, it needs to be done, and maybe very abrasively exerts that kind of pressure. So it's a bit of this psychological warfare. Other things that can constitute bullying behavior: humiliation, threats. There was a situation that I had encountered where a bully supervisor purposefully said to a direct report that they didn't really like, and purposely said to the direct report what the dress code was for an event where the president was going to be coming and having dinner. Everyone was dressed very nicely. The boss purposely said that it was business casual so that this employee would definitely not look as sharply dressed as him. And that's bullying. It's again, kind of a psychological warfare and wanting to humiliate. A lot of times what I see too is individuals will have their work sabotaged. They have a supervisor that may be a bit of a weak leader. Maybe the direct report is maybe 10 times sharper than the supervisor. And so the supervisor sees them as a threat. And sometimes the bullying behavior will kick in where the bully really wants to move in and try to sabotage that direct report because they want to extinguish the threat, especially for upward mobility. Sometimes bullies will really kick into high gear when they do have individuals who are peers, but more often than not, when they have direct reports that really can expose their incompetence. Yeah. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have a manager who's been promoted from within, and let's say it's to a director or VP level position. However, this individual seriously lacks leadership training and really lacks competence in the role. Well, this type of leader is weak. They typically are not going to provide the team with the tools and resources that they really need to do the job. This type of leader often will provide ridiculous deadlines, doesn't cascade information, expecting people to turn things around on a dime, and, causing them to have just this agonizing stress where they really should have had a longer lead time, but they just say, well, this needs to be done. And often what they will do is cite an upper level leader. Well, so-and-so at whatever higher executive level expects this to be done. And so what they do is somewhat threaten. Then when, said leader really sets this group up to fail, or in particular, they might single out one direct report that maybe a project or a task was assigned to, and then didn't provide them with the necessary tools or resources or timeline to be able to get it done. Then when it fails, then when they fail in the eyes of an upper level leader, the upper level leader will question, say, hey, what happened? This project didn't get across the finish line, and what happened? Then said leader will say, well, that was on Justin. He really dragged his feet on this one. And, I'm really going to need to talk to him about it. He might even be ready for a PIP. Oh, there it starts, you see. So this leader is insecure in his or her role. And what they do is they shift blame onto others for their mistakes. The old saying, throwing someone under the bus, comes to mind here. Well, why do they do that? Well, it's because they're not comfortable with conflict and managing up. If, let's say, they were given somewhat of an unrealistic deadline, in some cases even a ridiculous deadline, they're not comfortable challenging the boss to say, hey, boss, look, that's a little bit of a short timeline. Hey, do we have any wiggle room in that timeline? I'm really going to be tasking my team with working on overload here. That's a boss that would know how to manage up and negotiate for additional resources, negotiate for a longer landing strip for that project, but you get these leaders that get promoted. They are weak leaders and they truly just are incompetent at that level. And so what they do is they just exert pressure downward. But what they are really doing is in many ways sabotaging some of their direct reports' careers. It can stunt direct reports and their career growth because why? Well, the higher ups are in many cases already forming a very unfavorable opinion of someone. Let's say Justin is the direct report who's been set up to fail by this bully boss, and let's call him Barry the bully. Barry, the bully boss, goes to Justin and says, well, senior leader said this has got to get done, and, I don't care what you need to do, but this has got to get across the finish line. And then if Justin says, well, okay, I'm already working on these other two projects, and then bully Barry boss says, well, you got to figure it out. You got to get it done. Okay, so it's push, push, push. And then, of course, when, maybe Justin needed certain things from the boss to be able to accomplish the project, sometimes that happens too. And then, Barry the bully sort of conveniently forgets that. They often have selective amnesia. So then when Justin doesn't finish his assignments, then, Barry the bully boss goes to the higher ups and says, oh, well, Justin dropped the ball on this one. And, so the higher ups are really starting to see a pattern. Wow, Justin always seems to be missing project deadlines. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, Justin has been reaching out to his boss numerous times, lots of emails. He's been asking for resources, but the higher ups never hear about that, do they? All they see is that Justin is really blowing the deadlines. these types of bullies tend to be very, very good at schmoozing the VP and the C-suite level. They dazzle them sometimes with maybe industry jargon and technical knowledge, and particularly if they have an area of expertise that is unique, whether it be IT or, something like that, the other leaders really just do not have the technical capability. So they kind of dazzle them with a lot of that. And what they, will then do is not share any of kind of the people side of their job that they stink at. And so they turn to bullying behavior really as a bit of a protective mechanism. And as I said, in some cases, even purposely sabotaging direct reports who may actually be more competent than they are. One of the things that scares a bully to death is somebody that is really much more competent than they are who reports to them. That scares them to death. And that often will really lead to sometimes some very bad bullying behavior. While it may seem like bullying is the same as harassment, there really is a big key difference. Harassment and hostile work environment harassment is based on protected characteristics. So race, color, sex, religion, national origin, pregnancy, disability, military status, right? Things like that, genetic information. And so an illegal hostile environment is when someone is engaging in either discriminatory or sexual conduct that's unwelcome and creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. And it has to be severe or pervasive enough to interfere with work. But the key difference here is that a protected characteristic is something that falls under federal law. So bullying has to be so severe that it's created a hostile environment, right? So in other words, the federal statutes protect characteristics, including race, color, religion, national origin, sex, age, disability, pregnancy, citizenship, military service, right? These are the protected characteristics at the federal level. Now, some of you are going to be operating in states where you have additional characteristics based on your own state laws. But what I'm talking about here is just federal. The thing is, hostile work environment harassment, it's when those protected characteristics have been implicated. Bullying behavior, on the other hand, bullying is someone who is engaging in the sabotage. In some cases, it could be isolating others, humiliating, like the example of completely just defrauding an employee regarding the appropriate dress for a business meeting, business conference with a CEO where everyone comes dressed, in suits and they come in kind of business casual with jeans and loafers, definitely the odd person out. Okay, those types of things are bullying. But bullying is also sometimes kind of isolating others, purposely leaving someone out of the loop, purposely excluding individuals, maybe from key team meetings, purposely withholding certain resources so that they're set up specifically to fail. Things like that. That can indeed be bullying. But the key difference here is the hostile work environment harassment, and certainly based on the protected characteristics, as I said, that's what has to be implicated. That's what's unlawful. However, bullying is not unlawful. It is not. Bullying is not unlawful. Now, there are a couple of states that have passed some legislation. Puerto Rico just passed something, and Tennessee has the Healthy Workplaces Act. And also abusive conduct is discussed under California statute, where when you're doing harassment training, you have to also discuss abusive conduct. That's only a handful there. There are really, no other formal state statutes that specifically articulate bullying. What do you do then when you've got a case where you've definitely determined that hostile work environment is not prevalent? There was no uttering whatsoever anything that would be a protected characteristic, but you have the subject who engaged in some pretty bad conduct. So let's say it's Barry the bully boss. For starters, what you've got to do is look historically. Do you have anything in your case management system? And if you don't, you definitely need to get one and reach out to me. I'm happy to give you a recommendation on some good software. I'll give you the one that we use. You've got to look back on your cases. Has this subject ever been accused of this kind of misconduct before? If so, when? Was the subject actually issued any kind of disciplinary warnings? All right, so let's say you look in your case file and lo and behold, 2 cases on Barry where it's been alleged that the last couple of years he's engaged in bullying conduct. Unfortunately, one was not substantiated and maybe the other was substantiated, but Barry only received a verbal warning. Okay, but nevertheless, you've seen a pattern. Well, that can certainly weigh in when you're presenting findings, and then you're discussing what the organization should do in response to that. you've got to look at the egregiousness of the conduct. Did Barry just make some comments that were perceived as being a little threatening? Maybe, leveraging the name of the chief operating officer. Say, oh, well, Charlotte is just really, really going to be very unhappy if this does not get across that finish line. And, jobs could potentially be on the line if this doesn't get across the finish line. Now, I don't want to go back to Charlotte to say that this project will not get across the finish line. You see that type of conduct versus some real egregious conduct where, literally threatening someone specifically, let's say on email, really, bullying them to the point where it's so unethical what they've done and blaming someone for a big blunder that maybe the boss made and completely blaming someone and basically kind of shifting into almost gaslighting a little bit, if you will, completely excluding someone from a specific event in which they really needed to have been involved, particularly if there were decisions that were being made of which they really needed to weigh in. Okay, that kind of separating individuals definitely equates to bullying behavior. But then you've got to ask yourself, how many victims were there? Was it just one? Was it maybe one direct report here? Or are we talking multiple folks? Generally, when allegations have been substantiated for a pretty egregious conduct, in my experience, it usually will lead to a separation of employment. And the rationale with that is when you leave the subject in place, given their past conduct of bullying and that they tend to exert pressure and maybe they are even threatened a little bit by some direct reports that might be a little more competent. That old saying comes to mind here, leopards don't change their spots, meaning that if you leave them in place, if they bullied before, chances are they're probably not going to change. And they're probably going to even ratchet up the bullying because now they're really ticked because they got written up, they're held accountable, and maybe in a direct report even raising this complaint about the bully, well, now Barry the bully might just really ratchet up that on the direct report and maybe even really start figuring out a way to, quote, get rid of the direct report that kind of crossed them. So that, my friends, is called retaliation. And so this is where attorneys usually get a little concerned by leaving these individuals in place when, again, the conduct is pretty darned egregious. Okay, so that's a wrap for today's show. So I hope that this one has really helped to shed light on this important topic and that you now understand the difference between hostile work environment harassment and bullying. All right, gang, so I will look forward to seeing you next time on the HR Investigations Podcast. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with the case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.